guys, welcome back to part 2 of us discussing our most overrated and underrated MCU movies. If you haven't seen part 1, what are you doing here? Go back and watch part 1, and we will be right here when you get back. Don't worry, we ain't going nowhere. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. And I'm gonna go ahead and start this off, Ashton, if you're okay with it.
Yeah, totally fine.
Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and start stirring those pots.
Uh-oh.
Because I have got Black Widow as my most overrated MCU movie. Not only is Black Widow overrated, I think it was already universally, I wouldn't say universally, but a lot of the fans thought it was a pretty mid movie. I would go so far as to say that it is one of the worst Marvel movies ever put on the screen.
Like, okay, looking at the bottom 5 Marvel movies, in your opinion, where does it rank? I want to know
in
how
the bottom
low we're
5.
talking. In the bottom 5.
So if I can be completely honest, it's probably going to be not at the bottom. There's a couple other movies that are at the bottom, but we won't get into that today. I would go ahead and say it's probably in the bottom 5, but it's probably number 5. It's still saying something because at the end of the day, I was really excited about the idea of a Black Widow standalone movie, but that was also like 8 years ago. And so that leads me to my first reason why I think this movie was extremely overrated. This movie was released at the wrong place at the wrong time. Because you gotta think, this movie takes place right after Civil War. But take a guess as to when the movie came out. 5 to 6 years after Civil War came out. Black Widow's been dead for like a year. Like, for me, it's like correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I've ever seen an MCU movie where they kill off a character and then they make an origin story for that character 6 years after they're supposed to be making it.
Right. I mean, like, at this point, you should make, like, Iron Man 4. You know what I mean? Like, let's just
exactly.
get crazy.
And before anyone says, oh, you hate Black Widow. No, I repeat my original point. I love Black Widow as a character. She's one of the best OG Avengers characters, and she doesn't even have any superpowers. But I think they did her so dirty in her own movie because I feel like it was just to check off the box of, okay, we give the fans a Black Widow origin story. Let's get them happy. Let's move on to the rest of Phase 4. I thought that was a terrible creative choice by the MCU and, in this case, the executives. The action felt extremely clunky and sloppy. Black Widow should have died multiple times while she was falling. There's a couple of times where the theater just started laughing because she's falling from these super long heights. And at least in stuff like the first Avengers movie and stuff like that, they do a creative job of showing that she's human and she has to figure out how to be a superhero with all of these superpowered beings running around her. But in this one, they don't cut away from her getting manhandled and falling off of basically an apartment complex.
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! But not for me!
And she basically just stands up and goes, oh, well, I feel great. So for me, that's a huge problem because you take away the nuance of that character. Kind of like how in the Hawkeye show, they do a really good job of showing that Clint Barton is human and that he's going deaf in one ear. He doesn't recover as well as he used to. All the aches and pains of what it takes to be a human Avenger really caught up to him. And Black Widow is basically like, oh yeah, I probably broke my back and broke both of my knees. Well, life goes on. I'm gonna go ahead and just jump on this motorcycle and take off. That's the type of escapism that pulls me out of the movie. Because when you're sitting there thinking, wow, there's no way that happened, and not in a fun and entertaining way, you're automatically disconnected from the movie. Again, I want to reiterate, she is a human character. You can write a compelling human superhero, but you can't make a human indestructible. And I think that's where they made the mistake with her without showing as much of her flaws as they should have.
Right. I think just to piggyback off of that, I think what's interesting about what you're saying about her being human, it's almost like they went into it, whoever the director was of that movie, off the top of my head, I don't know, but it's almost like they went into it thinking, okay, we're going to make a superhero movie, when really they're just making an action movie in a superhero franchise.
Yep.
So it needed to be like an action movie with actual, like, mortal humans, but they came at an approach of, like, this is a superhero movie.
Right.
And that's why it feels unnatural, because it really just isn't like how it should be.
Well, it's like you read my mind, because that's literally my next thing that I wrote down, and I had this circled. This is a spy espionage movie, but it's been done better in The Winter Soldier. Because you got to think the premise is still the same, but the execution was so much more tight in The Winter Soldier than it was in Black Widow. There are so many contrivances and nuances and little plot points that seemed very forced in this. one of the biggest things that come to mind was the third act. Oh my gosh. Before I get into that, the first 2 acts were okay, but I still think that okay is not good enough, especially when you're in phase 4 of the MCU. I'm gonna get back to that in a second, but in the third act specifically, I think this is where that movie completely undid itself. We basically get to the point where we finally get these face-offs with the main villain. You finally get all of these emotional payoffs that you're supposed to be literally paying off in the third act, but they don't hit nearly as well. One of the parts that was just so incredibly stupid that I keep coming back to is, I don't know if you remember, but when Natasha finally faces off against the Russian guy who has been controlling all the Black Widows this whole time, and she finally gets close to him to take him out, only to find out he has cologne on that won't let her kill him. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember it being a little bit like that.
Because she's trying to kill him and he's like, oh, you can't because I've got pheromones. I'm like, dude, he sprayed cologne on this morning and that's supposed to... He says it messes with your mind basically and it tells you not to kill him. I'm so sorry. I don't know if people think otherwise, but the way I took that was so dumb. You know, like when you're a kid and you're playing freeze tag and you're like, oh, no, you can't touch me. You can't touch me. I said,
right.
I said timeout. I said timeout. Dude, that's exactly what they did with this, where they were like, oh, timeout. You can't tag me. It's kind of like
where was this during any Marvel movie? Because
every
hero should have that on at all times.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because they would just be invincible. That's the type of things I hate that they're doing with them. Like a lot of the Marvel shows and movies these days. Like a lot of the things they're doing now are contradicting a lot of what happened before, in a way where it's like, where was this during Infinity War? We could have really ended that much quicker. Or it reminds me of the Infinity Stones, right? Is that the Infinity Stones in Loki.
Yeah.
They were talking about how like
paperweights. They're using them as paperweights.
Yeah, like literally they did all that in the movies for those Infinity Stones. They, so many people died, all this stuff happened, and literally they have them as paperweights over here.
Yep.
And by the way, in Guardians of the Galaxy, they literally needed like 4 or 5 people to be touching it to even like
good point
be able to survive. Meanwhile, these people are just picking it up, putting it on paper. Yeah, just that's not very like, I don't know what you'd call it, like lore friendly. Like I just don't feel like it fits. Like
again, it's like you're reading my mind. I'm literally like, this is literally the next thing I was gonna talk about. It's like when you present something like the pheromone thing spray, whatever that is. You start asking questions like, okay, why can't she shoot him from 20 feet away? By the time the movie's in its finale, you're still asking questions like, okay, well, it's obvious it doesn't work up close. Why not step back and right from the back, and then you're good to go.
Right.
So when you present these type of things that have these consequences, you have to be able to present them in a way that feels natural and not something that's literally so specific to the situation that it forces the script to bend to your will. And that's the part that really took me out. Another one of my biggest gripes with this movie, one of my biggest, like top 5 out of my 37 million different problems with this movie is Taskmaster. I don't know how much you know about Taskmaster. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all. Taskmaster in the comics is one of the coolest people ever. He doesn't have necessarily a great backstory. He doesn't have one of the biggest fleshed out arcs, but when you see him, you immediately assume that he's a threat, because he has that ability to immediately copy people's movesets and have extreme cognitive awareness where he can see your moveset, copy it, and use it to beat you. He's extremely smart, he's tactical, he's extremely intelligent, he can make quick decisions, he's cunning, he doesn't really talk very much, one of those strong but silent kind of characters. And I thought he was so cool. And I feel like this movie really butchered the whole character of Taskmaster. They did decide to swap out the gender, and then they also decided to redesign the armor. Those 2 things in and of itself I don't have problems with. My thing has always been, as long as it suits the character, do what you think is best. But in this case, it does not suit the character, because instead of using a character with all of those great traits I mentioned before, they basically turned the character of Taskmaster into a brainwashed, half-burnt vegetable, because they really wanted to play the whole sympathetic villain route where they give Taskmaster the ability to be redeemed by Black Widow at the end, which, mind you, led to one of the worst bad guy versus good guy face-offs in a long time. It just felt so lazy, so rushed, and I don't think they really had the true essence of the character of Taskmaster in mind when they made that character. Going back to the first and second part of the movie, just so I don't forget about that, is they really did do certain characters well, like Red Guardian and Yelena Belova. I thought those were great additions. But I feel like, I can't confirm this. This is not me saying I have insider information. This is just me going with my gut. I feel like they needed to do this movie in order to give Yelena Belova the title of Black Widow in the future, and they needed to introduce her. And so they had to force this movie out because they needed this character to blossom into the future of Black Widow with Natasha Romanoff's death. So for me, in closing, with all of these problems that I have with this movie, that's exactly why I feel like it is not only the most overrated movie in the MCU's history, I think it is easily one of the worst.
Well, and I have something to piggyback off of that, just to completely dog on this movie even more. I think you did miss one. You're gonna know it right away. Yeah. Everybody pretty much probably will. But the CGI in this film, especially the explosion scenes towards the end, are probably the worst CGI in the entire series, even worse than like the 2008 movies. So, and this is what, 2022? It came out this year, I think.
2021.
Right? Well, was it 2021?
Yeah.
Anyway, it was so. It was like almost. I don't even want to say outdated because CGI, like when it was first invented, was better than this.
It's 2021. We should have some pretty epic CGI.
Yeah. They had better CGI in Jurassic Park in like 1990, whatever it was, and that was like the first CGI ever used. Like literally, so much better.
You can see the fuzziness behind Yelena when she does that stab into the pillar, where she goes, "This was fun," and you can see like the backdrop doesn't match up with where her head and her body is.
Right. It just, I mean, for the amount of money they make on these films, it's honestly just...
It blows my mind.
It's like, can you really not, like, just put maximum effort into this? I mean, we would still probably be getting really, really great films right now.
I agree, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because the CGI was something that I definitely wanted to talk about, but it totally slipped my mind just in my pure rage over this movie.
Right. There's so many problems, you forget some of them.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you for that. But with that being said, I think we need a little bit of a drum roll, because I feel like you have the most controversial take that I've heard from a single MCU fan in the past like year. So you have the floor.
Yeah, I think this might be my last time on the channel, depending on how this one goes. This is nice knowing you guys, but my pick for the most overrated movie in the entire series is Avengers Endgame.
Oh boy, explain yourself.
Well, listen.
No! This is not how this was supposed to go.
It's kind of like how you said this movie already, your movie, The Black Widow, was already a middle point movie, but to you it's more of like a lower movie.
Right.
For me, Endgame is, honestly, most people think of it as like the number 1 or number 2 movie in the MCU.
Or top 5 at least.
And I would say it's maybe around 5, 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Instead of like 1, 2, 3, 4, where a lot of people would put it. So I'm not saying this is a bad movie by any means, but there was definitely some things that I felt like were done better in other movies and just made it seem like overrated to me. For instance, especially a lot of people would compare it to Infinity War. I think Infinity War is the better of the two, which I think is fairly common.
I'm totally in agreement, 100%.
But there's a lot of people that like Endgame more. There's a lot of people that like Infinity War more. But I think there's just a lot of things that Endgame had, like Thor, for instance. You know,
Big Lebowski.
We lost him in that movie. Like literally, I don't even care about anything to do with him in that movie. Like honestly, except for the end. The end is great. The climax is great at the end, but it's a long movie. Okay, so there's a lot of parts in there, you know, where there was things that weren't the climax, because I think that's what everybody thinks about when they think of Endgame. They think of the end of Endgame.
Right.
And that part is really great. I think that's the first time we see all the characters. I'm pretty sure every single character that is alive at that moment is there, which is just insane.
So what you're saying is people are basically seeing the last hour of Endgame and they automatically apply that to the rest of the movie, which therefore in their minds makes it great.
Right, exactly. Already we have Hulk not being the cool Hulk. That's other movies as well, so I'm gonna give it the benefit of the doubt there, but that is something that is going on in this movie. Plus we have Thor being the not so cool Thor as well, so that's 2 out of the 4 like most main original Avengers basically not at their peak right there. And then also, when I mentioned Age of Ultron, I love that they're all together the entire movie. It's really focused on the characters we all know and love the most. I feel like Endgame is a little bit more sloppy with everybody all over the place a little bit. Just not like how it was in the first 2 Avengers movies. And that's not to say that the first 2 Avengers movies are better than this one by any means. I still think that Infinity War is the best one, Endgame is the second best one, Original Avengers is the third best, and then Age of Ultron is still the worst out of the 4, but they're all...
But you're comparing the worst out of the 4 when in reality all 4 of them are great.
Yeah, it's like an 8 out of 10 versus a 10 out of 10.
Right.
So it's not like that huge of a difference. I think a lot of people would say Endgame is a 10 out of 10. I'd probably place it more at like a 9 or 8 out of 10, considering the series and everything. I think I like Infinity War so much more. and also Civil War, I would say I like a lot more. Captain America: The Winter Soldier is one that I also really, really enjoyed. And there's probably a few more that I just can't think of off the top of my head that I'd rank above Endgame, and I just don't think that's very popular. So in my opinion, that would place it as overrated because most people would, again, put it 1 or 2, most likely.
Well, I'll be a little dramatic and jump on the hate train with you for a little bit.
Okay.
So,
Welcome.
yeah, there's a lot of room in here. There's nobody in here. So Infinity War is a complete movie. That's why everybody loves it so much. Endgame is the 2-parter sequel from a movie that's already had its beginning, end, and conclusion. And so you're right. If you're coming into Endgame, I would never, ever, ever recommend Endgame to anyone who hasn't seen the MCU.
Right.
But to be honest, I could probably squeeze in someone watching Endgame for the first time, and it's their first time seeing a Marvel movie. I could probably justify showing them that, because even though there's a lot of characters to learn, each character has time to really show off what made them so special in their standalone movies. And so if you had no idea what was going on, you could at least have a basic understanding. If I were to have my dad watch an MCU movie, he's never seen an MCU movie, by the way. If he was to watch one, of course I would start him out. If I was doing it the right way, I'd start with the older movies. Right. But if I had to start him out, if you told me Endgame or Infinity War hands down, and he could never see Endgame as far as I'm concerned. But he would at least be able to understand and follow. Endgame, for the people who are not loyal to the MCU for 10 plus years, are gonna have no idea what the heck is going on. Especially at the beginning when you, like you said, you have huge things like time travel. Iron Man solves time travel in like 10 seconds. You've got the Professor Hulk experience that solves itself off screen before the movie even starts. We don't even get to see that. It's more so of, hey, Hulk's here, deal with it, we're cool now. Now, maybe they look into it in the She-Hulk TV show that's coming out, but that's too little too late because we have no idea. They went from Hulk not speaking to Banner basically in Infinity War to now where they're like, all right, yeah, we're cool. And all it took was a little coffee shop conversation for them to be like, oh yeah, we're good now.
Right.
Damn.
It's a 4-hour movie. Like, you couldn't have found a little bit of time to explain some of that. And
right.
Again, it really sounds like we're hating on this movie, but compared to what the general buzz has been for it, it makes more sense when you look at it from an analytical point that it just doesn't hold up as well. I hate to say it, I really thought when Endgame first came out, I'd be watching it all the time. I'd be like, oh dude, I'm putting this on repeat forever. I bought the DVD box set, the most expensive copy I could find. I haven't even touched it since Endgame came out. Because you know what I'm doing? I'm going to YouTube and looking up clips from the movie.
Right.
I'm going and searching Captain America wields Thor's hammer. I'm looking at Iron Man snaps and saves, humanity. I'm looking at those because I don't want to watch a 4-hour movie. It's a lot of commitment. Same reason why I don't watch the Snyder Cut of the Justice League anymore. As much as I liked that movie, 4 hours is a lot to devote. It's just hard to justify sitting down for 4 hours to go through the messiness of the first couple acts just to get to that payoff. I'd much rather just skip to the end. And as for the Thor Lebowski, I'm going to just call him Lebowski, because the Russos have handled Thor's character pretty well. I said this in one of my previous videos that they handled his character in Infinity War perfectly. And I feel like in Endgame, I see where they were coming from because mental health, depression, all this kind of stuff is very real. And I think they were trying to go that route with him where he's lost everything and he's officially become basically useless. But I feel like it should have been dealt with a little more kid gloves than just saying, haha, fat man plays Fortnite now and drinks beer. That didn't sit well with me because they could have, they had some sweet moments like where he meets his mother Frigga and she has that conversation with him about he's never lost the ability to be worthy. Great moments, but they kept coming back to little cuts and little gags and little jokes that really don't do his character justice.
What do you think is coursing through my veins right now?
Cheese whiz.
And so that's why I definitely agree with you that Thor was not handled well.
Also, without Infinity War, like you mentioned earlier, how would you even watch Endgame? Endgame relies on Infinity War, but Infinity War by itself is fine, which means it is for sure better.
I definitely believe that there's a lot of flaws with Endgame in of itself, but I think especially I've learned to appreciate almost every single movie from phase 1, 2, and 3, because as I've mentioned before, I haven't held back my thoughts on the fact that I thought phase 4 so far has been incredibly mid, and as much as there's a lot of cool sounding projects in the future, I'm not as excited as I was before. And I know you and I have talked about this before, which is why even though Endgame is something that didn't hold up as well as we thought it was going to be, I really feel like at the end of the day, it's still a good movie, but still overrated. 100%
Right.
overrated.
It probably should be, like, in my opinion, about 5 spots lower than where most people would put it. And
Which is a big deal.
Which is it's big enough for me to call it overrated without exaggerating. It's not like a bottom tier, bottom half movie to me. It's a really good movie, but there's also a lot of other really, really good movies in the MCU that make it hard to justify placing Endgame for me in the top 3, or even it's probably scraping on 5, like I said earlier. So that's just where I'm at with that.
Well, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Ashton, thank you so much for being a part of this. I really appreciate you.
No, thanks for having me.
And guys, if you ever want to check out Ashton's stuff, if you're into weather or anything of that sort, go ahead and follow his channel. It's Direct Weather on YouTube. You can't miss it. It's got a big old logo with the DW on it. I'm gonna go ahead and throw it back to you guys. What is your most overrated MCU movie? And just as a little side note, I am on the road to 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your guys' help. So if you wouldn't mind clicking that subscribe button if you enjoy my content, leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and guys, we'll see you next time.